According to Steam, I've played Disco Elysium for 327 hours. Not bad for a game that takes roughly 20 to 30 hours to finish. It came out about 7 years ago, yet every now and then, I find myself wanting to go back and experience it all over again, and again, and again. I've replayed plenty of games over the years, but never quite like this one. Roughly 12 complete playthroughs. That's something that genuinely surprised me. Why did I play it so many times? Honestly, I'm not entirely sure. So, indulge me for a few minutes. In this video, I'd like to try and answer that question, not by reviewing Disco Elysium, but by understanding why it keeps pulling me back in a way no other game ever has. Disco Elysium is a very unusual game. It's slow. It's incredibly text-heavy. There is no combat. It uses tabletop-style dice rolls that can make you curse at the screen as if you're watching your favorite football team being robbed by an obviously biased referee. At the same time, it tells an intricate, often absurd, yet surprisingly believable story. It introduces a world with thousands of years of history, filled with political struggles, ideological conflicts, and social tensions that often feel uncomfortably familiar. Then there are the characters. From the protagonist to the most minor NPC you'll meet for only a few minutes, almost everyone feels like a real person with their own fears, motivations, and contradictions. They don't simply exist to give you quests. They feel like they have a life outside your conversations. Undoubtedly, it's the kind of game people tend to either absolutely love or bounce off after a couple of hours. There doesn't seem to be much middle ground. For anyone unfamiliar with it, Disco Elysium is, at its core, a murder mystery. You play as Detective Harry Du Bois, who wakes up after a 3-day alcohol and drug binge so catastrophic that he has forgotten, well, almost everything. He doesn't remember his own name. He barely remembers he's a detective. He knows virtually nothing about the world around him. It's certainly an unconventional place to begin a detective story. Mechanically, the game is presented as a classic isometric CRPG. You explore the world, talk to people, and investigate clues, but instead of defeating enemies in combat, your greatest weapon is your own mind. Conversations are constantly shaped by dice rolls based on your character's skills and personality. Some rolls simply reveal extra details about the world. Others unlock entirely different ways of approaching people, and the most important ones can radically change how investigations unfold, what information you discover, and ultimately, how your version of the story develops. There are no swords to swing or monsters to defeat. The real battlefield is inside Harry's head, where his personality, his doubts, and even his own thoughts constantly compete to influence every decision you make. My Steam page says I've spent 327 hours playing Disco Elysium. Some quick maths tells me that's roughly 12 complete playthroughs for a game that usually lasts between 20 and 30 hours. I never actually kept count. It's a bit like listening to your favorite album. You don't sit there thinking, this is the 15th time I've heard it. You simply press play because, for whatever reason, it feels right. That's quite unusual for me, though. Excluding roguelikes and ARPGs, where replayability is built into their very design, I rarely replay story-driven games more than once. Maybe I'll return years later to revisit a few missed choices or experience a different ending, but that's usually where it ends. Disco Elysium was different. I kept coming back to it almost against my own expectations, and for a long time, I couldn't really explain why. I think I've finally arrived at an answer, or perhaps more accurately, a collection of answers. Just a small warning before we continue, there will be some light spoilers from this point onward. The first reason is, inevitably, Harry Du Bois, or Tequila Sunset, or the Hobo Cop, or the Superstar Cop, or perhaps the most disco detective ever put into a video game. Harry begins the story as little more than a shell of the person he once was, yet that emptiness is precisely what makes him such a fascinating protagonist. His amnesia isn't simply a narrative excuse to introduce the world to new players. It transforms Harry into a blank canvas that you slowly reconstruct piece by piece. He can become an honorable detective or an absolute disaster. An ultra-liberal, a communist, a fascist, a moralist, or, more realistically, an inconsistent mixture of all of them. He can rely on intellect, instinct, physical strength, or sheer irrational confidence. In a strange way, you're not simply role-playing Harry, you're discovering who Harry used to be, while simultaneously deciding who he should become. And that's an incredibly compelling combination. As the story progresses, you also uncover fragments of the man he once was. Beneath the alcoholism, the self-destruction, and the endless poor decisions lies an exceptionally gifted detective. One of the best, in fact, but after the collapse of his relationship with his fiancée, everything else gradually collapsed with it. Throughout the game, you try, in your own small way, to help him climb back out of that hole. Not because the game promises some perfect redemption, quite the opposite. Disco Elysium constantly reminds you that real people don't heal overnight. Harry remains broken until the very end. He can make progress, he can become more self-aware, he can even begin to forgive himself, but you never truly know whether he'll eventually overcome his addictions or simply fall back into them. And strangely enough, that's exactly what makes me care about him. By the time the credits roll, I don't just want to know who committed the murder. I find myself wondering where Harry will be 3 or 4 years later. Is he still drinking? Has he finally accepted that the woman he loved has moved on? Has he managed to rebuild his life? That lingering curiosity is something I've rarely experienced with a video game character. To me, Harry Du Bois is one of the finest examples of a broken protagonist in gaming. But Harry alone couldn't carry Disco Elysium. A larger-than-life protagonist only works because every other character feels equally believable. The people you meet aren't there simply to admire Harry or move the plot along. They challenge him, they mock him, they ignore him, sometimes they even humiliate him. Every character has their own beliefs, ambitions, frustrations, and contradictions. They all seem to have lives that continue even after you walk away from the conversation. And I think that's only possible because the world itself feels so convincing. Revachol isn't just a backdrop for the story. It feels like a place that existed long before Harry arrived and will continue to exist long after he leaves. The second reason I keep coming back to the game then, I think, is Revachol itself. Because Revachol isn't simply the setting where the story takes place. It feels like one small window into a much larger world. The districts of the city are described with such richness and attention to detail that it's easy to forget they don't actually exist. Even though you never leave Martinez, you gradually build a surprisingly vivid mental picture of the rest of Revachol. You can almost imagine the crowded streets of Jamrock, the elegant avenues of Grand Couronne, the busy financial heart of La Delta. None of these places are directly explorable, yet they somehow feel real. And then you realize that Revachol itself is only one island in the world of Elysium. Throughout the game, you're constantly hearing about distant countries, different cultures, old empires and political movements, not as random pieces of lore, but as places with their own identity, history, and people. By the time I reached the end of my first playthrough, I felt as if I'd spent weeks reading a history book about a country that never actually existed. That's one of Disco Elysium's greatest achievements. It convinces you that the world continues far beyond the edges of your screen. You don't simply want to solve the murder, you want to spend more time in Elysium. And that's why replaying the game doesn't really feel like replaying it. It feels more like returning to a place you've missed. Every new playthrough becomes an opportunity to notice another detail, get a little piece of extra precious information thanks to a skill check you missed the previous time, or simply better understand a piece of the world's history that completely went over your head. Every replay adds another thread to an already enormous tapestry. Then there's the soundtrack. It's difficult to explain exactly why it works so well. It doesn't simply accompany the game. It is Disco Elysium. It captures Harry's state of mind better than words ever could. Melancholic, dreamlike, fragile, occasionally hopeful, yet always carrying the feeling that everything could collapse again at any moment. Few games have music so perfectly intertwined with their identity that it's impossible to imagine one without the other. I was so captivated by the soundtrack that I looked up the band behind it, Sea Power, hoping I'd discovered a hidden musical gem. But surprisingly, that wasn't quite the case. Don't get me wrong, I think they're a great band. Their music is genuinely good. What surprised me was that, outside the context of Disco Elysium, I simply couldn't feel the same sense of melancholy, longing, and emotional turmoil that the game's soundtrack evokes. And I think that's because the music and the game elevate one another. The soundtrack isn't merely great on its own, it's completing the experience. Remove the game, and something important disappears. Remove the music and the game loses part of its soul. So, after thinking about it for quite some time, I think I've finally found my answer. I didn't replay Disco Elysium 12 times because I wanted to optimize a build, or because I was hunting achievements, or because I wanted to see every possible variation of Harry's personalities. I kept coming back because I simply wasn't ready to leave. Harry, Revachol, its characters, its history, its music. Together they created a world that somehow feels strangely real, despite being one of the most unusual settings ever put into a video game. And perhaps that's the greatest compliment I can give it. 7 years later, I still occasionally feel the urge to go back, not because I've forgotten it, but because somehow I miss it. And what about you? Have you replayed Disco Elysium multiple times? And if you did, what kept bringing you back? I'm really curious to hear your reasons. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like and subscribing for more gaming discussions. I'll see you in the next one.